But I think he was an angry man. I think he was disturbed for some reason or other. That's all I've got to say about it.
Would you dispute any of the things he said? Because he claims they're facts.
Oh, well, they're not, because I think it's well documented. But I'm not going to get into that because at this moment in time, I think we should concentrate.
There's a photograph that tells you everything. Two men on the touchline, standing close enough to speak, and yet the air between them could freeze water. Ferguson and Wenger. The greatest managerial rivalry English football has ever seen. But what about the men who fought in that war on the pitch? The soldiers who absorbed that hatred, carried it home, and never quite put it down. Today, we're looking at the players who didn't just dislike Arsène Wenger, they made it personal. And for some of them, it never stopped being personal. If you wanted to understand what Manchester United stood for in the 1990s and early 2000s, you didn't need to read a biography. You just needed to watch Gary Neville play. He was Ferguson's most committed soldier, a man who didn't just represent the club, he became the club. United's identity ran through him completely, and that meant something specific when Arsenal arrived under Wenger and started rewriting what English football was supposed to look like. Neville never hid his discomfort with Wenger's vision. The continental training methods, the nutritional overhaul, the quiet dismantling of the old British football culture. Neville saw all of it, and he didn't like what he saw. He framed his objections in the language of football analysis, talking about tactical imbalances and squad philosophy, but underneath that, there was something simpler. This was cultural defensiveness. Wenger's Arsenal made British football feel provincial, and Gary Neville felt that personally. On the pitch, he channeled it into aggression. Those United Arsenal games from 1997 through to 2005 were war, and Neville was always in the middle of it. Physical, combative, absolutely determined that Arsenal would not walk off that field feeling comfortable. He didn't just want to win those games, he wanted Arsenal to feel beaten. There's a difference. What makes Neville's story strange is what happened later. When Wenger's final years at Arsenal became increasingly difficult and the Emirates crowd started turning on their own manager, Neville publicly criticised Arsenal fans for the way they treated him. He called for patience. He defended the man he'd spent a decade trying to dismantle. It looked like growth. Look a little closer, and it reads differently. Neville spent years attacking Wenger's football, his methods, his teams, and then, once Wenger was no longer a threat, he could afford to be generous. The resentment didn't disappear, it just found a more comfortable costume. Even in retirement, the obsession never fully left him. As a pundit, he returned to Arsenal, to Wenger again and again, measuring, critiquing, reassessing. A man who had truly moved on wouldn't still be checking the score. Neville's bitterness was ideological and verbal, expressed through microphones and camera lenses rather than flying boots. But it was bitterness all the same. Not everyone kept it in words. September 2006. West Ham vs Arsenal at Upton Park. Pardew's team score. Pardew celebrates the way managers sometimes do when the emotion gets away from them. Arms out, wheeling toward the Arsenal dugout. What came next shocked everyone watching. Wenger reached out and shoved him. It was brief, it was undignified, and it became one of the defining images of just how combustible this rivalry had become. Wenger received a touchline ban. Pardew walked away looking like the victim. But Pardew wasn't simply a victim. The months before that moment had included Pardew publicly questioning why Arsenal fielded so few English players, a line of argument that Wenger found offensive enough to label xenophobic outright. That's a serious accusation. Pardew pushed back, but the damage was done. The moment he made the nationality of Arsenal's squad a talking point, he moved this beyond football analysis to something uglier. The shove on the touchline was Wenger losing his composure. The English player's comment was Pardew showing his. He spent years after that incident angling to be seen as someone Wenger had wronged. There's truth in it. Wenger did shove him, and that was wrong. But Pardew's habit of provocation and then performed outrage ran through his entire career. He knew exactly where the line was, and he pushed right up against it every time. Phil Neville operated differently. Where his brother Gary wielded words, Phil wielded his body. His job in those United Arsenal fixtures wasn't to create, it was to destroy. Specifically, to destroy the rhythm of whoever Arsenal had in midfield. Through fouling, through pressing, through refusing to let talented players breathe. He was very good at it. Ferguson used him as precisely the kind of blunt instrument that Wenger found infuriating. The 2004 Battle of the Buffet sits at the centre of this. A post-match tunnel confrontation after United ended Arsenal's 49-game unbeaten run, the moment everything boiled over. Food thrown, bodies jostling, and complete chaos in that narrow Highbury corridor. Phil Neville's physical marking of Jose Antonio Reyes throughout that game had been relentless. It wound Wenger up to breaking point before they even got to the tunnel. Phil didn't start the food fight, but he'd spent 90 minutes making sure the temperature in the room was high enough something was going to go wrong. Both Pardew and Phil Neville chose disruption as their primary tool. Neither of them will be remembered for what they built. They'll be remembered for what they tried to break and the fact that it never quite worked. Joey Barton always understood one thing about public life. If you can't be the most talented person in the room, be the loudest. When it came to Arsène Wenger, Barton was never going to be the most talented person in the room. So he went the other route. Barton built a significant portion of his media identity around attacking people he considered intellectually pretentious. Wenger, with his university education, his philosophy of football, his dignified press conferences delivered in careful English, the perfect target. Barton repeatedly went after Wenger's reputation as a thinker, framing the Frenchman's measured, analytical approach as a kind of arrogance dressed up as intelligence. In Barton's reading of the world, thoughtfulness was just another word for weakness. He said it often enough that some people started to believe he had a point. He didn't. The 2011 incident with Abu Dhabi brought this into sharp focus. Barton's conduct during that match was aggressive in the way his conduct usually was, not the committed, purposeful aggression of a player fighting for a result, but the kind that crosses into something personal. Wenger didn't hold back afterward, called Barton out publicly, and what he said cut through the noise because it was specific. This wasn't a manager protecting his players' feelings. This was Wenger identifying a pattern, naming it clearly. What Barton did next was entirely predictable. He accused Wenger of being a bad loser. Think about that for a moment. Joey Barton, a man who spent his career collecting red cards, feuding with teammates, and turning every disagreement into a public spectacle, looked at Arsène Wenger and decided the problem was that Wenger couldn't handle losing gracefully. The irony doesn't need commentary. It just sits there. The deeper issue with Barton's attacks on Wenger is what they actually revealed. Barton consistently mistook aggression for honesty and mistook provocation for courage. When he went after Wenger, he wasn't speaking truth to power. He was punching at a target he knew wouldn't punch back in kind, because Wenger didn't operate that way. Barton's entire approach depended on finding opponents who would either fight him or flinch. Wenger did neither. He just kept winning, kept thinking, and kept building football that made Barton's brand of chaos look exactly as small as it was. Sam Allardyce had a theory about Arsène Wenger, and he spent an entire decade testing it. The theory was this: if you made the game ugly enough, if you squeezed every technical, rhythmic, flowing moment out of it through physicality and long balls and relentless pressing, you could rattle Wenger. You could get inside his head. Allardyce, when he managed Bolton Wanderers through the mid-2000s, didn't just believe this theory. He built his entire tactical identity around it. He openly admitted to enjoying winding Wenger up, not just winning against Arsenal, not just grinding out results, specifically winding the man up. That's a telling distinction. Most managers talk about competing. Allardyce talked about irritating. His approach to Arsenal fixtures wasn't really about football. It was about one Frenchman standing on the opposite touchline and how much of that Frenchman's composure Allardyce could strip away over 90 minutes. The resentment underneath all of this ran deeper than tactics. Wenger arrived in England in 1996 and within a few years had fundamentally changed the conversation about how the game should be played, what players should eat, how training sessions should be structured, and what success actually looked like. For managers like Allardyce, who had worked their way up through the English football pyramid the hard way, building reputations on organisation and physicality, this felt like a personal insult disguised as progress. Allardyce never quite accepted that the game Wenger was playing was simply better. So, instead, he did what he could. Made Wenger's team as uncomfortable as possible, called it a strategy. Frosty relationship between the two men never thawed. Not once across that entire era did it soften into something resembling mutual respect. Allardyce carried that coldness into retirement, and it said more about him than it did about Wenger. Teddy Sheringham came from a slightly different place, but the feeling was the same. Sheringham was a craftsman of the old school, a centre-forward who read the game beautifully, who had survived and thrived through decades of English football, understanding its rhythms and its culture. When Wenger's Arsenal arrived and started playing a version of the game that Sheringham's generation hadn't grown up with, it wasn't neutral for him. It felt like a challenge to everything he represented. His run-ins with Wenger's players during matches had that flavour. Sharp-elbowed, verbally combative, the reactions of a man determined to prove that his way of doing things still mattered. The verbal jabs that followed those on-pitch moments carried the same energy. Sheringham never accepted that the arrival of Wenger's philosophy was anything other than a threat to British football's soul. Whether he was right is a conversation. The fact that he never stopped feeling threatened is not. Both men represent the same generation, making the same choice. Resentment over adaptation, grievance over growth. Neither of them left Wenger's reputation smaller for it. Every name on this list sat clearly on one side of the line. They were against Wenger, and they stayed there. Sol Campbell is the one who crossed over, and his story is more unsettling for it, because it shows just how deep the roots of this hatred actually went. During his years at Tottenham, Campbell wasn't just another player who occasionally faced Arsenal. He was the face of North London's resistance. Tall, powerful, commanding, was exactly the kind of defender Wenger's technical players found difficult, and he knew it. The intensity between Campbell and Wenger's Arsenal in those late 1990s fixtures went beyond professional competition. It was tribal. It was the kind of hatred that gets into the crowd and stays there, turns a football match into something that feels genuinely tribal and raw. Campbell absorbed all of that energy, and for a time, he gave it back. Wenger saw Campbell differently, of course. He saw a defender of rare quality, kind of athlete who could anchor a backline and free up the rest of the team to play. What Wenger wanted, and what Campbell represented at Spurs, were almost perfectly opposed, which made the eventual outcome all the more dramatic. In the summer of 2001, Sol Campbell walked out of Tottenham on a free transfer and signed for Arsenal. He didn't just leave Spurs, he crossed the defining boundary of North London football and joined the man his old club considered the enemy. The reaction from Tottenham supporters was ferocious and lasted years. Campbell later described it as one of the most isolating experiences of his professional life. What's easy to miss inside that story is what it says about the hatred that came before it. If the resentment during his Spurs years had been purely professional, just two sides competing, the move would have stung and faded. It didn't fade. It consumed him, because the culture he'd been part of at Spurs wasn't just competitive, it was a tribal system, built on the idea that some loyalties are permanent and some enemies are forever. Campbell eventually rejected that system, but rejecting it didn't mean escaping it. The wounds from those years at Spurs, the intensity of what he'd been part of, the weight of what he was called after he left, none of that disappeared when he lifted the Premier League title at Highbury. His story is the most complicated one here, precisely because he eventually chose Wenger's side. But even that choice came with a cost. Hatred he'd been surrounded by at Spurs left marks on him that winning trophies didn't erase. He understood, better than anyone else on this list, the resentment directed at Wenger was never purely about football. It was about identity, about belonging, about a tribal code that didn't allow for nuance. Campbell broke that code and paid for it for the rest of his career. We're getting to the part of this story where everything starts to connect. Before we do, if you're finding this as fascinating as I am, make sure to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. Now, back to the story. Pull back from any individual name and look at what all of these men share, and a pattern comes into focus that's uncomfortable to sit with. Neville's ideological resentment, Ardew's xenophobic undertones, Barton's performative aggression, Allardyce's tactical obsession with one man, Sheringham's cultural defensiveness, Campbell's tribal wound. Different men, different methods, different careers, the same origin. Wenger made them feel like the game they loved had moved on without them, and they never forgave him for it. That's the thing about Wenger's impact that gets underplayed. He didn't just bring better football to England, he brought an entirely different way of thinking about football. And for a generation of British players and managers who had built their identities on the old way, that felt like an accusation. Not an explicit one. Wenger never stood on a touchline and told anyone they were doing it wrong. Didn't have to. The results made the argument for him. Year after year, his teams played in a way that made certain approaches to the game look limited, and the men who relied on those approaches felt it personally. Ferguson is the figure you have to place at the center of all this to understand it properly. He matched Wenger year after year without descending into the kind of pettiness that defined so many of his players. Ferguson's rivalry with Wenger was fierce and sometimes bitter, but it had the quality of two men who genuinely respected what the other had built, even when they refused to say so out loud. His players didn't inherit that restraint. They inherited the intensity without the perspective, and it left some of them in places they couldn't easily get back from. Lasting damage isn't just personal. These men carried their resentment into punditry booths, to management roles, into public platforms, and it became part of how they were understood. Neville still gets defined in relation to Arsenal. Allardyce's Bolton years get remembered as much for the anti-Wenger tactics as for anything else. Barton built a media personality on provocation, and Wenger was one of his clearest targets. None of that made Wenger's legacy smaller. His record sits exactly where it always did. The Invincibles season doesn't shrink because Joey Barton called him a bad loser. Wenger left English football in 2018. Some of these men are still talking about him. That's not commentary on Wenger. It's the most honest measure of how much space he occupied in the minds of the people who opposed him, and how little they were ever able to do about it. Wenger's gone. The touchline battles are over. The rivalry is history. And yet the men who fought in it are still carrying it. That says nothing about Wenger, and everything about the cost of building your identity around someone else's failure. If you've been gripped by this story, drop a comment below and send some love to everyone who lived through that era, on both sides of it. Hit the like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and we'll see you in the next one.